I would like to introduce you all to Courtney Morris, who is a visual and conceptual artist and assistant professor of gender and women's studies at UC Berkeley. Courtney's work examines the intersections of ecofeminism, environmental racism, and queer ecologies, which are all topics that we'll be exploring tonight. Her work is concerned with understanding the ways that we inhabit place through migration, ancestry, and a shared social memory, as well as how places inhabit us. So please, join me in welcoming Courtney to the stage. Hi, Courtney.
Hi, Kiana.
How are you?
Good. I'm a little nervous.
Oh my God, I think we have the most beautiful crowd tonight.
Oh my God,
Everyone's so
amazing.
excited.
I'm so excited to be here.
Well, thank you so much for being here. I am such a huge fan of your work. And at IE, something that we love to start conversations with is our origin stories. So please introduce yourself and your work and tell us about the life experiences that led you to do the work that you do today.
Wow, thank you all for being here. It's so amazing to see all of you here and just to see the diversity of the crowd and all of these young people here. It makes me feel like, oh, the children are all right. I'm a lot less worried about the future. I teach at Cal. I'm a visual artist and an anthropologist by training. I completed my PhD. Ow.
You got that hood. You know,
Yeah.
the PhD hood? I'm such
official.
a big fan of that.
And the pink cushion cap, yeah, I rocked it. And so I finished my PhD in anthropology at the University of Texas at Austin. And as a graduate student, my work focused primarily on studying Black and Indigenous women's social movements, specifically looking at their movements for communal land rights and demands for territory. And at the time, I wasn't thinking specifically about the environment. I was more interested in thinking about kind of social and political questions and thinking about issues around state violence and the ways that Afro-descendant communities and indigenous communities were generating their own collective strategies for resisting these ongoing and historical processes of territorial dispossession and racialized state terror. And then when I finished my PhD, I got a postdoc at Rice University in Houston, Texas.
We have some Texas fans here tonight.
What's up, Dirty South? I moved to Houston and I lived there for 2 years. And while I was there, my mother's family is from Louisiana. My father is an immigrant from Jamaica. And yeah, I'm all over the map, y'all. And while I was living in Houston, I was spending a lot of time going to Louisiana to visit my grandparents who lived about 2 hours away. And they were living in Beaumont, and then later on they moved back to a town called Mossville, Louisiana. That's located just north of the Port of Lake Charles, which is one of the largest cities in Louisiana and also the 12th largest, home to the 12th largest industrial port in the United States, and is a major point of transit for petrochemical products in the United States. And we can move a little bit so I can kind of walk y'all through, but you know, we started, let me do one more slide. And it got taken over by a petrochemical company, and I'll talk a little bit about that more later. But when that happened, I was so furious and full of so much rage and just wanted to try to understand how this could happen to a community that meant so much to me that it really forced me to start thinking about what a Black feminist thinker or what a Black feminist politics around the environment would look like. And it made me wonder why I hadn't thought more about the environment before. And so that really prompted a major shift in both my research, but it also catalyzed a major shift in my life because it really pushed me back into making art. And so in that way, it's been really committing to an ecological politics has really changed my life in ways that I think have been for the better, and have really created an opportunity for me to think about how we can develop collectively creative responses to the crisis of climate catastrophe.
Wow, that sounds like just such a beautiful life, and you know, I think something that a lot of us within the environmental justice movement come up to is we all grow up having, you know, dealing with a lot of issues within our own positionality and personal life experiences and have all of these things that we care about, but don't necessarily think of environmentalism as that. So I was born and raised in Iran, and growing up I really cared about human rights, as we all know right now. And growing up, I also really cared about butterflies and plants and conservation, and I never really thought about the intersections of those until I was in an academic space where I was able to learn about, human rights being environmental justice. And I'm really glad that you touched on that and that we get to explore that a little bit tonight. So throughout our conversation, we will be exploring 3 themes that have inspired your work: environmental racism, ecofeminism, and queer ecologies. So we'll begin with environmental racism. Can you tell us what that is for anyone that might be new to the term?
Sure, and I got a slide with it too. So I teach classes at Cal about the environment. A class that I developed recently that I've been teaching now for the past 2 years is a class called Feminist Environmental Ethics. So if any of y'all are at Cal, get at me. And in that class, we really talk a lot about how people who are coming from fields like Black studies, Indigenous studies, Latinx studies, gender and women's studies, like the departments that I teach in, what kinds of insights we can bring to bear on the climate crisis when we apply concepts like critical race theory, when we apply feminist and queer theory to thinking about the environment. And so, in my own work, I think a lot about the politics of environmental racism, which I describe as, really trying to understand how racial discrimination operates in the ways that environmental policy is crafted, in the kind of practices of corporate decision-making, in the sort of everyday practices that we see unfolding in our communities, which results in the inequitable distribution of environmental burden along lines of race, class, and geography. And now this seems like kind of a common idea, right? But there was a time where it was very difficult to make the argument about the connection between race and the sort of uneven distribution of toxic environmental pollution. And so some of you may be familiar with a report that was released 35 years ago in 1987 called Toxic Waste and Race in the United States. If you haven't read it, it's available online. It's actually really short. I assigned it in all of my classes. And that study was really crucial because it was the very first study. It was conducted by the United Church of Christ. They had created a commission on racial justice. And they found that Black and Latinx communities were up to twice as likely to be sited within 1 mile of a toxic facility compared to white communities of comparable class status, right? And even when you accounted for things like class status, even like middle class Black and brown communities were significantly more likely to be the sites for the locations of toxic facilities. And so this was something that, like I say, in the moment was kind of a revelation, but now it's so obvious, right? Like, we drive around the Bay Area and you can see there are no petrochemical facilities in the Berkeley Hills. Yep. There are lots in Fruitvale, there are lots in Richmond, there are lots, you go out to Vallejo, you can see how the sort of siting of these facilities corresponds to, kind of popular understandings of race, class, and where it's imagined that these facilities are supposed to go. And so the way I talk about that in my work, and we can move forward to the next slide, is by focusing on my mother's hometown. And my mother is from a community called Mossville, Louisiana. And the thing about Mossville that I didn't even know when I was a child going there, I grew up in Texas, in Killeen, Fort Hood. I'm an Army brat. I know it's so complicated, y'all.
That's for another talk.
But that's another talk. Next time, I'd love to come back. But as a child, I spent a lot of time going to Mossville, Louisiana, and visiting my mother's family there. I loved it. It was a site of so much love and happiness for me. And I just sort of took it for granted that the plants were there. But Mossville, Louisiana is actually a historic freedmen's community that was founded shortly after the Civil War by formerly enslaved Black people who were looking to create their own safe haven after escaping the horrors of slavery. And they did. They created a kind of semi-autonomous community that was sort of, I never saw white people in Mossville as a child going there, even in the 80s and the 90s. It just was a Black space. And it was a vibrant space. They had churches, they had their own schools, they had community centers, they had businesses, they had nightclubs. It was a community. But that community in the 1930s and the 1940s became a kind of major site in the development of the petrochemical industry. And so from the 1940s forward, all kinds of companies began developing, putting facilities out there, petroleum refineries, coal-fired power plants, vinyl manufacturers, natural gas manufacturers. And so by the time that I started doing research about processes of environmental racism in Mossville, in about 2013, there were 14 different petrochemical facilities surrounding a town that's about 5 square miles in area. Tiny. Like if you blink while you're driving through it, you'll miss it.
That's so interesting because I went to Berkeley as well, and one of the first environmental justice classes I took, one of the professors was like, no one really knows if it's the chicken or the egg. Like, we don't know if all of these polluting companies go into black and brown neighborhoods and set up shop, or if black and brown people go to these neighborhoods where these companies exist. And I was like, I don't know about that. So I'm glad that you're teaching the reality.
Yeah, I have really strong feelings about that. I don't think there's no chicken or the egg argument to be had here. There's a very clear pattern, and actually we could jump forward a bit, Sammy, to the raw materiality of race theme, and we'll come back to those. We will come back.
She's an artist.
So, because I am an artist. But, in my work, I talk a lot about what I call the raw materiality of race. When I started studying the history of environmental racism and how the plants began to settle and build facilities around the community, it became very clear to me that race is absolutely the single most important factor in determining the siting of toxic facilities, period. Corporations are well aware of this. They've gotten very good at developing a kind of greenwashing discourse where they pretend that they don't think about race and that they're race neutral and colorblind. But it's absolutely not true. When companies, particularly multinational petrochemical companies, are making decisions about where they're going to put facilities, race is at the top of the list in terms of determining what sites are the most viable. So in my work, I talk about this idea of the raw materiality of race, where I argue that there's a clear relationship between ideas of racial difference and material value, and that understanding of this relationship between racial difference and material value, that black labor and black land is cheap, it's disposable, and it's deeply exploitable, is really at the heart of corporate practice and how these companies operate and make decisions.
Wow, yeah, I'm so glad that we got to explore all of that. And also I love these slides. I think it really shows that you teach and you have these beautiful lectures. And yeah, I think it's so important that we do set the record straight, because a lot of times there are people speaking for us. There are all of these white experts that are talking about environmental racism, are teaching environmental justice classes, and they've never actually lived in the reality of what that experience is like. And so the misrepresentation is just crazy, it doesn't make any sense. And I'm really glad that we get to create spaces like this where we're democratizing access to education, and we're able to create community spaces where we can create a dialogue about all of these issues, especially in our own backyards. So next, I would like to ask you about ecofeminism. And you've touched on this a little bit, but when you begin to add the layer of gender, we really begin to see intersectionality and the framework of intersectionality begin to form. So can you define ecofeminism for us?
Sure. Next slide. So I work a lot with ecofeminism. This is another piece that I've been working on from a photo series called Bodies of Water. And ecofeminism is really it's a multidisciplinary approach that really tries to think about really tries to think about the interconnections and the relationships between women, non-human animals, and nature within Western thought. And it really tries to think about how systems of structural violence like patriarchy, like capitalism, objectify both female bodies and also objectify the body of the earth. and through that process of objectification, then justify the exploitation and the pillaging of those bodies, right? And so it was a concept that really kind of came together in the late 1970s, early 1980s. I think about thinkers like Greta Gard, for example, who's really kind of one of the first, critical feminist thinkers who articulates an idea of an ecofeminist politics. And, I think that when we look at the way that systems of knowledge, the way that corporations approach their relationship to the earth, we can see very clear parallels between how people are also seen as exploitable, as commodities. That same kind of logic that could commodify the bodies of enslaved Africans is the same logic that sees the earth as this kind of dead, inert, passive resource that can just be endlessly exploited for the purposes of capital growth and exploitation. So in my work, I try to think a lot about those relationships and to think about, ways that we can, take that relationship between our bodies as human beings and the body of the earth and say, well, there's something actually really beautiful about this, right? That if we recognize that there's a parallel between those different kinds of bodies, then we can understand, as there's a Black feminist poet whose work I really love, Lucille Clifton, who wrote this incredible poem called The Earth is a Living Thing. If you've never read it, you can look it up right now on your phone. But she talks about this idea of the earth being a living thing, that it has its own autonomy, that it has agency, that it has will, and that needs to be respected in the same way that we are making demands in our social movements and in the societies in which we live, that the personhood, the autonomy, the agency of historically marginalized and exploited communities, that also needs to be recognized as well.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting. That's a layer of ecofeminism that I find so just unique and interesting, and the way that we think about the exploitation of Mother Earth and what even is that term Mother Earth and why do we use it, and we'll talk about that later. But just that a lot of the issues, the social issues that we face are also very rooted in the same issues that we face with environmentalism and conservation, and the exploitation of the resources that we have are also rooted in slavery and rooted in just patriarchy and capitalism, and all of those things are so interconnected, and I think it's really important that we touch on all of that. So we've been talking a little bit about your art projects, and you are an incredible artist. And so can you tell us about the project you worked on in Louisiana and just how that came together and how it relates to both environmental racism and ecofeminism?
Yeah, so some of those slides that we skipped through earlier, thank you, Sammy, you can just stop right there. So when I started doing work in Louisiana, I was really in that moment kind of focused on my career as an academic. And so the first thing I thought was, I gotta do research about this. So I started doing research about it. And as it turns out, to be a good artist, I think you also need to be a really good researcher because it really shapes your practice in ways that I think are important and generative. And so I started studying the history of the community, which I had not done. And that's something that when I talk about Mossville, I really encourage people. You may all come from small places, right? Some of y'all are local to the Bay, but I bet a lot of you come from small places and you're like, oh, that place isn't important. It is. And it's really important to develop deep relationships with the small places that you come from, to develop relationships with your ancestors and their stories and their experiences of those landscapes, because the story that you have to tell about the earth lives in your body. Right? It lives in your DNA.
That's a quote.
Get deep into your small places. And so when I started doing research about this, it felt like, okay, this is important, but I also felt the urgency of the story of Mossville in my body so deeply that I started to, I started to dream about the place. I started to see these images, and I was just like, I gotta tell the story in as many ways as I can. And so going back to Mossville and really getting connected to the environmental story that was unfolding there really also opened up this space in my life, and it returned me back to my art practice in a way that I hadn't expected. So I also think about the pleasure of becoming a deeply aware ecological citizen, right? Like, it will change your life in ways that you cannot imagine, and often for the better. And so connected to the earth connected me back to my art practice, and I just started taking these photographs and like going and documenting the community. So this is a piece called Colored Swimming Pool. It was a historically segregated swimming pool in Mossville. People had to really fight to get that community space, and it just was really thinking about the politics of water and, you know, resources and how Black communities struggle for resources. And so I kind of channeled this energy of the church lady. My grandmother was kind of my muse for this project. So I'm wearing her hat, I'm wearing her gloves, I think that might be her purse. And then you can move one slide over. I took a bunch of photographs in the historic Black cemetery where all of my grandmother is buried in that cemetery now. All of her people dating back to prior to the end of slavery are also buried in this cemetery. And so I kind of created this, and we have indigenous ancestry. This is all things I found out doing research. So I wanted to honor the indigenous ancestry of our line, honor the native peoples of southwestern Louisiana, the Atakapa'i Ishak, who do not have federal recognition but are very much alive and present in the community. So this is a figure who acknowledges that ancestral indigenous root in our family line. And this character is called She Who Sits with the Dead. And you can go to the next one. And then, you know, again, I went to the community documenting what had been there when a company took over in 2012. There was a South African petrochemical company called Sasol that decided to expand their facilities on the edge of Mossville. And essentially what they ended up doing, they reached an agreement with the governor of Louisiana at the time, a man named Bobby Jindal, who, you know, basically gave them carte blanche to come into the community. And then after the agreement had been signed, they notified the residents of Mossville that this was happening. And the company ultimately ended up holding a buyout program where they would buy out the homes of community members. And not that long ago, a legal clinic working out of the University of Connecticut found that there was massive racial discrimination in the buyout process. So that white homeowners who were displaced by the expansion of the Sasol facility were offered much more money than Black residents in Mossville. But, you know, people who participated in the buyout, not only did they have to leave their homes, they also had to tear their homes down before they could receive the funds from Sasol, which to me just felt like such a violence. And so I wanted to document what remained of the community so that there would be an archive, because someone driving through Mossville now would never know that there had been this vibrant community there, and I wanted people to know that we were there. So there's like a lot of photographs in my series. I developed a series called Solastalgia, and Solastalgia is a term that was developed by an Australian environmental philosopher named Alldread. And he developed a term to describe the kind of deep sense of existential grief and loss that people experience when they lose their home spaces and their natural environments to forces beyond their control. And I was like, that's Mossville. So all the photographs that you're seeing come from that series, and they're up on my website if you ever want to check them out.
Yeah, everyone should go check them out.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you for exploring all of your beautiful work. I think storytelling is such an important part of the environmental movement. And you know, I think I studied data science, funnily enough, and sometimes I think we, in the environmental movement, we're like, we gotta hit everyone with the facts. You know, like, this is how many years we have left, this is the degrees, this is like how many tons of CO2 we need to remove from the earth. But even though the facts are really, really important and they need to inform the work that we do, I think a lot of times what really moves people to take action is storytelling, and is telling the stories of not only what will become, but also what has happened. And I think it's really important that, you know, we have these tangible stories of what solastalgia looks like, and what eco-anxiety looks like, and what so many of these issues that we speak to in the future actually have looked like in the past and have already been hurting the people at the front lines. So I think it's really, really important, and a really big part of the work that we do at IE as well. So we've seen some of your amazing art, and this event is all about eco-optimism and joy and creating space for art. So I would love to skip to my favorite part of this conversation, which will be about queer ecology. So can you tell us what that means? And then we'll explore some of your work there as well.
Absolutely, cue it up, Sammy.
The dolphins, they're love.
Yeah, dolphins in love, gay dolphins in love. So the concept of queer ecology ecologies, I talk a lot about this in my teaching. It describes an interdisciplinary approach to the study of the social and the natural world that attempts to disrupt the sort of prevailing heterosexist ideas and kind of institutional articulations of sexuality in nature, and to reimagine evolutionary processes, ecological interactions, and environmental politics through a queer theoretical frame, which is just a fancy way of saying that nature is a lot more gay than we realize. So, you know, as kind of biomedical regimes of knowledge developed in the 19th century, a lot of the people who do work in queer ecologies draw a lot of inspiration from the work of Michel Foucault, who really talked a lot about how our ideas of what is quote unquote natural in terms of human sexuality, human desire, and social behavior is premised on a sort of heterosexist read of the natural world that ignores the complex sexual diversity of the natural world, right? So if we were to look at, you know, when we talk about, you know, when there are ideas circulating in the mainstream, like right now, the kinds of discourses that we hear around the kind of pathologizing of trans identity, the pathologizing of gender nonconforming subjectivities, all of that is linked to this idea that there's some quote unquote natural normative way to be in the world. But when you study nature closely, as any scientist who really is, you know, doing their work well will tell you, nature is really heterogeneous, it's unpredictable, it's complex, it's like, it's flamboyant and it's excessive. Just wild unpredictability, right? And, you know, there are a number of scholars like Katriana Sandilands who edited a volume called Queer Ecologies who were like, well, if we look at nature, nature's telling us something different, right? We can see it when we look at the behavior of marine mammals. We can see that when we look at the behavior of certain primate species like bonobos who handle all their problems through fucking. And we can, you know, see it through, you know, all kinds of species. And so what that tells us is that we shouldn't look to nature as some kind of like stable, unchanging, clearly defined binary system that can then help us figure out our own stuff. Instead, we have to think about how it is that we bring our own kind of social frames to understanding nature and impose our own kind of heterosexist logics on nature that don't hold up in the face of rigorous scientific scrutiny.
Yeah, I remember when I first learned about this, I was just like mind blown because, you know, when you grow up, you think of so many things as like the norm or the natural, and I think that can be applied to so many things like body hair, for example, or just like the way that we appear, and it's really wild that these white, straight, cis men have created our society's norms, and then they're like to everyone else that this is what it is to be natural, this is what it is to be normal. And we all grow up feeling like we don't belong in the world, we don't belong in nature, we don't belong in our own communities because we don't look like that standard, we don't look like that norm that was set up for us. And when I learned about this, it was just incredible. The joy and the beauty that exists in the natural world is just makes everyone, I think, feel seen and feel like they belong. And I'm really glad that we get to explore it as well. Yeah. So art is really important to us, as we've talked about. And you worked on this really incredible project around queer ecology. Can you tell us about that and share some of the beautiful shenanigans you were up to?
I'd be happy to. So let's go back here. So and over the last year, I've been collaborating with two really awesome feminist performance artists who are a couple. You may have heard of them. Beth Stevens and Annie Sprinkle. Anyone know Annie Sprinkle? Queen of the Golden Age of Porn.
You will after today.
You will after today. Go and check out Annie Sprinkle. But they published a book a year ago called Assuming the Ecosexual Position, The Earth as Lover. And I had come across them in 2020 when I was participating in a performance art workshop that was being led by Guillermo Gomez Peña and his crew, La Polla Nostra. And so they came in and they shared a film that they had made called Water Makes Us Wet. Check it out. And they shared this idea that they were developing at the time of ecosex and ecosexuality. And I remember, you know, sitting in my living room, like on a Zoom call, watching them talk about this. And as soon as they said that, I was like, wait, what? And they were like, we consider ourselves ecosexuals. And I was like, what is that? So this is what an ecosexual is, according to them. Next slide.
Are we having tech problems?
Oh, we might be.
Okay, we're good.
Excellent. So they define an ecosexual as a person who finds nature romantic, sensual, erotic, or sexy, which can include humans or not, a new sexual identity, which is, of course, you take that on yourself. It's a person who decides to take the earth as their lover. It can be a term used in dating advertisements, so apparently, I don't know, I've been out of the game a long time, but apparently the kids use it on Tinder. It can also describe an environmental activist strategy. It's a grassroots movement. It also describes a person who has a more expanded concept of what sex and orgasm are beyond mainstream definitions. So if you've ever had that like sexy feeling in a shower, you know what I'm talking about. It's a person who imagines sex as an ecology that extends beyond the physical body. And it's an ever-evolving, growing concept. And this just blew my mind because they said, in a lot of environmental discourse, and understandably, there are indigenous traditions all over the world that conceptualize the earth as a mother, which is perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with relating to the earth as a mother. In fact, that can be a deeply reverential and beautiful way to engage with the earth in a much more kind of like intimate way, right? But Beth and Annie said, well, Beth and Annie come out of a pleasure politics background, right? Beth was, has long engaged with kind of pleasure politics in her creative practice. Annie is a sex worker, has done a lot of work around sex worker advocacy and, kind of thinking about pleasure as a sort of source of joy in doing social activist work, social activism and like social transformation work. And they both were like, the problem with environmentalism is it's not sexy enough.
We're trying to make that difference.
Yeah, it's not sexy enough, it's not exciting enough, it's not joyful enough, and we need to find ways to bring more joy and pleasure into our politics. And that really resonated with me because so much of my environmental art up until that point had been about processing my grief and my rage. And that was important, but I also felt like in the long run that would not be sustainable because I don't want my politics to only be fueled by anger. I don't want my politics to only be fueled by grief. I want my politics to also be life-affirming and celebratory and joyful, right? And this just really appealed to me. And so Beth and Annie, since 2008, you can go to the next slide, have been hosting a series of green weddings.
How cool do they look?
Aren't they amazing? I love them so much.
They're embodying Ravina.
They're my favorites. And they've been hosting these eco weddings since 2008. So they've gotten married to like the fog, they've gotten married to the Mediterranean Sea, they've gotten married to the redwoods and to coal. And I mean, it's just amazing. And they create these kind of big carnival-esque weddings where they invite, strippers and burlesque performers and fire twirlers, and it's all the things happening there to celebrate all of the ways that they are committing to treating the earth as a lover. And this year, they got married to fire in Boulder Creek, just outside of Santa Cruz, and they invited me to perform. And performance art is another kind of dimension of my creative practice. And so, in a lot of the work that I've been doing over the last 2 years, I engage really deeply with a spiritual tradition out of West Africa known as Orisha Ifa. Some of y'all know.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So, Orisha is the ancestral spiritual practice of the Yoruba people of Nigeria, and the pantheon is composed of Orisha. There's one god, whatever misconceptions people might have, who's known as Olodumare, but the Orisha represent all the kind of natural systems and forces of the planet Earth. And so when Beth and Annie invited me to perform in the fire wedding, naturally, for people who are familiar with the tradition, my first thought was, I have to do something for Shango. And in Orisha cosmology, Shango is the Orisha of thunder, lightning, and fire. Also kind of the embodiment of a certain notion of like masculine virility and sexuality and pleasure and desire. So it just felt like a really serendipitous kind of meeting. And Shango in the tradition has many partners, but one of his partners is an Orisha named Oya, who is also the Orisha of the wind, of air and breath, of storms, and who's also considered the guardian of the cemetery. And Oya is really interesting because she's a femme deity, but she's an unconventional femme deity. She's a queen, she got her own kingdom, she don't need no king. She's an independent woman. She and Shango are married, but she's like, you can't live with me. And I don't want to live with you. She takes other lovers. Shango also takes other lovers, so they're poly. Like, there's just so much going on in their relationship, and I thought, wow, this would be really interesting to do something together. So you can go to the next slide. They had invited another performer, another Black femme performer from Brooklyn, New York, who's named Dragonfly, aka Robin Laverne Wilson, who's now my boo and my creative partner. Not my boo like that, but my creative boo. But yeah, she's amazing, and she was also really interested in working with Oya's energy, and so we thought, okay, why don't we collaborate and do something together, and basically offer a queer reading of what are called patakis in the Yoruba tradition, and patakis are kind of like parables. And so the idea was to tell the story of their relationship through performance. So you can go to the next slide, Sammy. So I used these silk fans to create kind of a movement of fire and air to kind of show that relationship between air and fire, how essential they are to one another. And you can see Beth and Annie there in the back. Annie with her epic fire crown. Amazing. And then there's Dragonfly in the next slide, dancing and performing as Oya.
So powerful.
Yeah, it was really powerful. And then we held, because the wedding was held outside, it also just felt, I mean, it's an earth-based spiritual tradition, so holding it outside felt really special and powerful. You can go to the next slide. And then we basically concluded the reading of the pataki by circling each other, waving our fans, dancing and honoring the Orisha, and then sealing it with a kiss. Yeah, to celebrate the love between these two energies. And it was one of the most beautiful experiences of my creative life. And it just felt like such an amazing way to bring play and pleasure and sensuality and beauty and joy into my work. So I'm so grateful for the gift that art is in my life and just all that it continues to give to me.
Wow, I couldn't help but just like watch you bring up all of these photos, and this looks like such an incredible space and so affirming and beautiful and tied to so much of your culture and so much of just everything else in queerness that speaks to, I think, so many people. I have enjoyed this conversation so much, and I think this idea of the lover, the earth being our lover, is something that is going to sit with me for a really long time, and I hope it sits with everyone for a really long time. Thank you so much. I wish I was still at Berkeley so I could take your class, but anyone who is definitely should. And where can folks check you out? The rest of your work.
You can find me, I'm on the gram. My handle is Creole Maroon. Creole like the culture, maroon like the color, like Jamaicans, y'all know what's up. Or you can find me on my website, www.CourtneyDesireeMorris.com. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Courtney.